Hello, and thank you for joining me. Today we are taking an in-depth look at how to pull off making a beautiful blackberry pie from scratch using fresh, not frozen, blackberries. From scratch means we will be making the crust ourselves, which you shouldn't be intimidated by. I do a lot of explaining for every step of the process, so if you enjoy detailed guidance, this is the video for you. And once the pie comes together, you will see it was well worth all that effort. And really quick, I want to mention at the top, please like the video and hit the subscribe button for more videos like this. I'm a professional chef and I try to pass on the information I've gained over the years with in-depth video recipes. And of course, comment if you have any questions along the way. So let's jump right in by starting with the crust, which will need time to rest in the fridge before we can use it. When I make pie crust, I always follow a recipe for a slightly modified pâte brisée, which is just the French name for a basic short crust used for pies and tarts. One nice thing about this recipe is that you can use a ratio to remember it. The ratio to remember is 3-to-1. 3 parts flour, 2 parts fat, in our case butter, and 1 part water. I will provide measurements for a double crust recipe, but I still find the ratio helpful to memorize as it can be useful when cooking on the fly or when one ingredient is in limited supply and you have to adjust. And real quick before we get started, I wanted to say that I'm using a food processor to make my crust, but you can absolutely use an old school pastry blender, which I still sometimes do. So, starting with the flour, I have here 370 grams of all-purpose flour, about 3 cups, and to that I'm adding a teaspoon of salt and 2 tablespoons of regular sugar. Now I just give that a quick whisk and set it aside. Now for the fat, in our case butter, I need 240 grams or 2 sticks plus 1 tablespoon. And I'm just going to cut that butter into small pieces. And because I want this butter to be nice and cold, I will actually put it in the freezer for 5 to 10 minutes before I bring the pie crust together. With foods like biscuits and pastry crust, you always want your butter to be cold, because cold butter gives you that flaky effect. Once the butter has been nicely chilled, I get out my food processor and set it up using the standard blade attachment. Then I go in with my flour mix, give that a few pulses just to make sure that the sugar and salt is well mixed in. Then I go in with the pieces of butter, making sure that they are evenly distributed throughout the flour. And because space is a little limited, before I use all the butter, I will pulse the machine once, which will coat all those initial pieces of butter and flour, and then I add the remaining butter bits. Now this is the first point where we want to have a delicate touch. We want to break up the butter, and to do that we use the pulse function on the food processor. Don't just turn the machine on. We want short little bursts of the blade spinning, just enough to break those butter bits into smaller pieces, and you'll be able to see them in the flour. And it should look something like this. Now we can move on to adding the water, and this is cold water by the way, and in accordance with our ratio that should be about 120 grams or about half a cup, but do not add everything at once. There is a chance you won't need all of this water because humidity levels can really affect how much the flour will need to come together. So again, we need a delicate hand, and we just add a splash of water, give the machine a couple quick pulses, another splash of water, a quick pulse, and then we take the top off the machine so we can see what is going on and determine if we need a bit more of that water. You want the mix to look a little bit chunky and irregular, akin to wet sand, and it should hold together a bit when you squeeze it between your fingers. Now I just pour that dough out onto the counter and give it a gentle knead, basically just enough to bring it together into a mass. At this point, we wrap it in plastic wrap or an airtight container, and then that gets put in the fridge for about 30 minutes to an hour. As the case is with many things involving flour, One must allow the gluten to rest so that it is easier to work with. The process of making a homemade pie may feel slow with all these little breaks and resting times, but they really are important. I can tell you after years of making pies and trying to cheat on time that it's better to just have patience. In the meantime, you can sort, rinse, and measure your blackberries. We'll need about 6 cups, but aim to have a bit more than that just so you have some flexibility. Again, I'm using fresh because they are in season at the time of this video, but I will provide options for frozen in the video description. We will be adding sugar and other ingredients to the berries a bit later, but I like to do that at the last minute to reduce the amount of juice buildup, which can make a bottom crust soggy. After our crust has rested, it's time to divide and shape it. We need 2/3 of the dough for the bottom crust and the remaining third for the top crust. And I usually eyeball this, but if you want math on your side, that should be about 500 grams for the bottom crust and about 250 grams for the top, respectively. Once I divide the dough, I knead it just a bit to get it back into a disc shape, which follows the shape of the pie form naturally as we roll. Speaking of which, we will start by rolling out the bottom crust. I first dust the counter lightly with flour. I place the dough down and then I give it a little dust of flour on top as well. Then I use my trusty old-fashioned rolling pin to begin expanding the dough. I start by pressing the rolling pin into the dough over the entire surface before starting to actually roll. This just helps loosen everything up a bit. Then I follow standard rolling practice, roll a bit, give the dough a quarter turn, keep rolling, quarter turn again. Sometimes I will flip the dough over to make sure nothing is sticking. Give yourself a little flour if you need, but don't go too crazy with it. If you notice that your dough is feeling elastic, pop it back into the fridge and let it rest for 15 minutes or so, which will calm down the gluten. And as is often the case, you will get some splitting at the edges of the crust. This frustrated me a lot back in the day, but over the years of pie patience training, I learned to deal with it. All you have to do is overlap the pieces a bit and squish them together. You don't want excessive flour on the dough at this point, or it will be difficult to do. You want a bit of stickiness. And once these splits are remedied, it should just be a matter of continuing to roll out until you reach the proper size for your form. I always keep my pie plate close by so I can check to see where I'm at, but of course you could use a ruler if you know your dimensions. You want to roll out a bit beyond the size of your mold to give yourself some wiggle room. Mine was looking a little under, so I gave it a few more rolls, and then I had it where I wanted. Some people roll the dough up onto the pin to get it into the pie form, but mine is usually sturdy enough to just take it in my hands. And so I just set it in the pie dish as squarely as possible. And then I run a small knife around the edge of the rim to trim off the excess dough, which I really don't have much of. And with that, our bottom crust is ready. I just put that in the fridge while I get started on the top crust. If you find that you have some gaps and the crust isn't quite covering the lip completely, just use some of your trim to patch it up a bit. I won't tell. No one will ever know. I'm actually pretty self-conscious when it comes to working with dough on camera, so I usually opt for simple designs, but I was feeling bold and decided to go for the lattice top. It just looks so nice, especially on a berry pie. So the first order of business is to roll out that dough as we did before until it is big enough to cover the top of the pie plate. And once there, I just trim the outermost edges a bit with a knife, and then I let it rest in the fridge while I prepare the berries. You will want to have a nice large bowl to mix your berries in. I first go in with my 6 cups of blackberries. It's a good idea to give them a taste first, because next up is the sugar, and if you feel that they are super sweet, add half a cup, about 100 grams, but if you feel they need a little extra help, add 3/4 of a cup, about 150 grams. Mine were not super sweet, so I went with the larger amount of sugar. And then I add the zest of 1 whole lemon. I also add the juice from half of that lemon. And some people like to add spices, but I'm kind of a purist and just really like that clean taste of blackberry lifted a bit by the lemon. But feel free to add spices like cinnamon if that's what you're into. And then we need a very crucial ingredient, cornstarch. I'm adding 6 tablespoons. Cornstarch will keep the filling from becoming overly loose, and once cooled, it will give the inside that classic gooey, inviting look and allows for proper slicing. Tapioca starch is also an option, and old-fashioned recipes will often use just regular flour, but I feel like this gives the pie a slight stodginess that I don't love. Once all the ingredients are in, I just give the berries a few tosses to make sure everything is nicely coated in the mix. I don't want to overmix as these berries are very delicate, and even with the cornstarch, juices will start to accumulate. And with that in mind, let's waste no time on finishing our top crust. Once we have the size we need, I want to cut the crust into ribbons. So I use my grater as a ruler and a pasta wheel as a cutter, and I portion the crust into decorative strips. And once I have 8 pieces, we are ready to go. So I pull out the pie plate with the dough set in it, and before I dump in the berry mix, I just want to give myself a little extra insurance, and I will dust the bottom of the plate with an extra spoon of cornstarch. Then I pour in the berry mix. At this point, I will also brush the lip of the dough with a simple egg wash to help seal the crust. And now we are ready to braid. I start by laying down 5 strips across the pie, which are running vertically on the screen, which I'll call 1 through 5. Now it's just a matter of weaving in the 3 strips horizontally. First, I start by peeling back strips 2 and 4, and I slide a horizontal piece in towards the bottom third of the dish. Then the vertical strips come back up. Now strips 1, 3, and 5 get peeled back, and another horizontal piece is placed in the very center of the plate. Then the vertical strip gets moved back into place, and now 2 and 4 come down again, and the last horizontal piece is placed in the top third of the dish. And then once again, 2 and 4 go back into place. Now I just go around the rim of the baking dish and press the pieces of dough together to join them. Then, using a knife as before, I trim off the excess bits of dough. And for a final bit of decoration, we will do a fluted edge with the dough. But first I need something to work with, so I'm kind of pinching the top edge of the dough so I get a bit more of a ridge to it. And then I just use the classic thumb and forefinger technique from the one hand with the forefinger from the other hand to go around the edge of the crust and create that wavy effect. And I know I said that was our last bit of decoration, but I lied. Let's pull that egg wash back out and brush all over the pastry. And then I have a special chunky pearl sugar here I will sprinkle all over the top. And now we are officially ready for the oven. So I have that preheated to 400 Fahrenheit, 200 Celsius, and the pie goes in the center of the rack, set just below the middle. And we let that go for 25 minutes. But definitely check in at the 20-minute mark to make sure the color is okay, because all ovens are different. By the 25-minute mark, I was happy with the color, so I decided to cover the pie in foil to prevent further browning. I then dropped the temperature of the oven to 350 Fahrenheit or 180 Celsius and continued baking for another 25 minutes. And then I peeked under the foil to confirm that we were good to go. With fruit pies, you want to see the filling starting to bubble up through the crust, and we definitely have that. Also, looking through the pie plate, we can see that the crust is a nice golden brown color. This pie is done. But, as mentioned earlier, making pie is a thing of patience. And this last act of patience is no exception. You really need to let the pie cool off completely, or else it'll be a soupy mess when you go to slice it. And after all that hard work, just give it the time it needs. And so now we have cooled off, but before we slice it, let's just take a moment to appreciate how pretty it is. Yes, the lattice could use a little bit of work, as could the rim, but it's still really inviting looking. That's one of the things I love about pies. Even when well made, they have a bit of a rustic look to them. They aren't like the perfect pastries you see in French bakery windows. They are more evocative of good home cooking. So let's get a nice slice here. And you can see our patience has paid off. That is a nice slice. It holds together well, and it has just the right amount of gooiness oozing onto the plate. The only thing that could make this better would be a scoop of homemade vanilla ice cream, of course. It doesn't get much better than that. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this detailed look at the process of making a fresh berry pie from scratch. As long as you have a bit of patience, there is no reason why you can't do this yourself. And so I hope you give it a try. And of course, if you liked the video, hit that corresponding like button. It not only feeds my ego, but helps my videos show up in the vacuum of space. A subscription is helpful as well and can be done with a mere click of a button. And I'm very responsive in the comment section, so don't hesitate to drop a line. Until next time, cheers.